Good afternoon. Who said LCAP wasn't a lot of fun? Listen to this. Well, I'd like to welcome you, and I'd also like to welcome our colleagues in Palmdale, right over here. Okay, Palmdale is joining us via, see, all the friendly people. Palmdale is joining us via webcast thanks to the amazing work of our technology office, who just about a week or so ago said, can you make this happen? And they made it happen. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that. I'm Bonnie McFarland. I am a project director for local control and accountability plans and categorical programs. If that sounds like an oxymoron, not so much. It seems to work. But we'd like to welcome you today to our first LCAP implementation. You needed a breather for a while after getting plans in, and was probably about almost 2 months ago now. I was watching the state board meeting, and a very familiar face popped up, and that was Nancy Brownell. And I suddenly turned the sound way up and listened, and she talked about the fact that she was working with the state board as a liaison to and senior fellow with the state board, and she had been working with Common Core and continues that work, but she had taken on the work of LCAP implementation. She was barely out of the room when I was on the phone asking Nancy to come down and work with us, because what she described felt to me exactly like where districts are and what they're needing right now. And beyond that, I've known Nancy for a long time, and I knew she was the perfect person to deliver that message. If some of you have been around for a while and you've been through changes and you feel like, oh my gosh, what's coming now? Is this going to be another pendulum swing? Is this going to leave my schools rocking and frustrated and thinking that everything they did before made no sense and let's start all over again? That's certainly always the fear with the new initiative. But Nancy's been rolling out new initiatives for probably at least 20 years now that I know of. I first came to know her when she was working on the old language arts standards back in 1997. That would put that close to 20 years now that she began that work. And that was a real change. The language arts standards that came out in 97 were a change for California. And then subsequent to that, we had the California Reading Initiative, which was a huge change in reading instruction and working K-12 with partnerships. And again, Nancy was at the forefront of it. But what Nancy does that I really respect and appreciate is she doesn't treat everything like a brand new idea that nobody ever thought of before, and we should forget everything we've learned. What she always does is take what we've learned and what we do well in the past and moved us forward. So how does this new initiative move us forward? And I really appreciate that, and I think teachers in the classroom especially really appreciate that. So that's one reason, and then the other reason, not only does she bring that moving forward, but she brings it moving sideways too, because we're also implementing Common Core, and Nancy was the senior fellow supporting implementation of Common Core. So you can just see when I heard she was doing this work, she had to be the right person to come, and she is so gracious. I called her and she said, I'll be there. So thank you, Nancy. So let me tell you the official Nancy, because I probably forgot, so that's my view of Nancy, okay? But she is a senior fellow for local control and accountability and Common Core systems implementation, with responsibilities for working with both the State Board and the Department of Education. That's a challenge right there. Nancy has many years of experience as a teacher, administrator, educational leader, supporting the goals of increased student achievement and equity for all students. She's taught kindergarten through university, has an administrative experience and expertise in implementing standards-based curriculum and instructional programs, developing assessments, and coaching district and school teams. She's also a school board member in Rescue, California, so she's on a school board there. Prior to joining the state board and CDE, she was assistant superintendent of instructional services at the Sonoma County Office of Education. So you can see that kind of backs up all my faith in Nancy, and really appreciate you being here to help us move this work forward, Nancy. Please help me welcome Nancy.
I've got the mic on. Can you hear with the mic? Good. Hence the term senior, right? I'm older and experienced. I've had the pleasure of being an educator in this state for my whole life. I'm a native California. I grew up in Northern California, and I've been either on the receiving end of education in the state as a student or on the delivery end as a teacher and administrator. And I'm very excited to be here to help kind of you think through some of the ideas related to your LCAP. And the most important thing about me is I have a 5-year-old grandson who started kindergarten this year, and I was looking at his paperwork this weekend, and he was decomposing mathematics, and I was very excited, even though he just sort of looked at me and goes, grams. I mean, it's like, geez, everybody knows this. And my daughter happens to teach in LAUSD down here as well, so I had the pleasure of spending time with my family over the weekend on my way here. So, as you know, there's been a lot happening in our business over the last few years, and I think part of the context of the changes that are underway is these are huge sea changes in the way we organize schooling. So if it feels complex and difficult and a little bit hard to do, you're right, it is. And I'm not telling you probably anything that you don't already know. So the good news is, I think in terms of the implementation pathway that we are all on, is that it's very likely the governor will be reelected in a couple weeks. And many of these initiatives have really taken shape under his leadership, Mike Kirst as president of the state board and Tom Torlakson as superintendent. So as things change, chances are with the governor's role particularly, we will have another few years to really fully implement. And I think that's the other part of this change, is this is a long-term effort. And so expectations to have sort of immediate results, while we would all like that, it's really going to take a little while to do that. So just for my sense, how many of you are site leadership, principals, coaches, working in the site level? And you too, Palmdale, thank you. How many are district office leadership? Good. Any school board members, colleagues? Oh. How about county office folks? Good. Anybody that I left out? So we have a good representation. Well, good. Well, you probably know LCAPs way more intimately than I do, although I've been reading and looking at them. But as Bonnie mentioned, I'm on the State Board LCAP team. There's a few number of us that are working on these, on the initiatives, and I'll try to kind of keep you clear on what we think is happening, because this is really quite an evolving, iterative process, right? It reminds me of teaching a new grade level, or moving to a new school, or working on a new project where you're only just a little bit ahead of the folks that you're trying to teach. And I'm sure a lot of you are feeling like that. But isn't it an interesting time to be in education? As I mentioned, I've been around for a very long time, and this is really one of the most exciting times, and my grandson's going to greatly benefit, along with his younger brother. And I want everybody's grandkids to benefit, because this is an important initiative in our state. So hopefully today we'll have a chance to delve a little deeper into a lot of the work that you're already doing, with some expectations, hopefully, that you'll gain some additional thinking today. Probably, if I've really done my job, you'll leave with more questions than answers. Sorry to say, right? Because the work that you are engaged in has a lot of pieces to it, and we're just really at the beginning phases of it. I want to really talk about progress monitoring and communication strategies. I spent the last 2 years traveling around the state, listening to lots and lots of people talking about what they were doing with Common Core. And one of the key pieces of really my project was, what kind of communication strategies are you establishing? And obviously the heart of one of the big changes in the local control funding formula is much more robust community and parent engagement, right? And just because you got folks engaged at the front end, how are you helping them understand what you're doing all along the path? And that's really a critical piece, I think, that I've discovered not a lot of folks really haven't spent as much time perhaps as they might think about. And then the idea that we really have formative metrics this year. Year one of your 3-year plan, right? It just so happens that we've changed the assessment system so you don't have any summative data yet. We've changed the finance system and we're trying to work out what's the basic supplemental concentration grants. Thanks to the business folks in the back of the room too. There'll be hopefully some ideas that you will be able to contribute to the work you're doing. And that leaves it to you at the local, hence the term local control and accountability, right? We all had to learn the governor's word subsidiarity and went, what is that? It means those closest to the students are responsible for what happens. And he really does mean that. So the notion that while there may not be summative data, and while the 8 state priorities have about 26 indicators, those are mostly sort of end of the story indicators, right? Grad rate, great. My school's a K-8 school. We want to have our kids graduate from high school. Us using high school grad rate probably doesn't help us much. We'll track our kids, but some of those measures, while critically important in the context of LCAP and the 8 state priorities, they're sort of at the end of the story. So what are you going to do in the middle, in the front end? And how many of you are on trimester systems? Right? And aren't you almost coming up to the end of your first trimester? Well, what's your report card to the community and to your board about where you are and what you've accomplished and where you're going? Formative practices, right? Formative measures. If you're on a quarter system, you're probably a little bit further, right? And some of these are big goals. You're not going to accomplish much in a trimester. But at your boards, your communities, your families would like to know, how's it going? So all through this afternoon, I want you to be thinking about, what do you have in place for communication? Do you need to add some more things? And or what's your timeline? Because that's critically important for everyone, particularly in this first year, right? Because it's new for everyone. And even if you said, gee, we're going to do this, but we didn't quite accomplish it, or we've got these pieces of it in place, that's okay, right? It's formative learning. This is all about learning for all of us. And hopefully you'll gain some priorities. So a little bit of context here, right? Local control and accountability plans, and I want to make sure we keep in mind that it's both control and accountability. Who's responsible for it, right? Look around the room. If you're here with your team, we are responsible, right? We need to be accountable because it is about how we're meeting the needs of the students in our local context. And that looks different in Palmdale than in Rescue, than in San Francisco, than in Downey, than in Calexico. And that's all right, but what are the accountability mechanisms you have in place to see how your progress is going? It's a reminder that this continuum of connections is part of the intent, really, right, of the LCAPs as a reflection of the local control funding formula. It's about your needs, your local needs, your assessment of that need, your goals, your resource alignments, your services, and your student outcomes. And I'm going to bang away at this today on the student outcomes. It's not so much just the actions and services in your LCAP. Part of the reason I suggested you bring an LCAP with you or you have access to it, I could have put some pretend LCAP stuff together, but you might as well look at your own LCAP, right? Because that's the real deal. And I'm going to leave and go back to Northern California, and you're going to get to stay and keep working on it. So what is it around how that is progressing that links to your student outcomes? That's one of the things I noticed in reading a lot of outcomes. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. We're going to hire 4 additional instructional aides. We're going to hire a new coach to work with the elementary schools. We're going to buy more technology. And what's going to happen as a result of that? Didn't write it down. Probably have some good ideas about that. But that's the stuff that we're trying to move from, right? It's not about the inputs. What happened as a result of your actions and services? That's what your annual report is going to show this year. Here's what our goals were. Here's what our activities and actions and services are. This is what happened as a result of that. Some for good, for bad, for didn't happen at all like we thought it would. That's okay. But don't leave that piece out. Don't leave that piece out. That's what seems to be sort of, and again, short timeline, quick turnaround, get that, right? It's a plan. But we're, quarter trimester way into first year. So what's happening? This is obviously situated in the developing new accountability system, which we haven't developed yet. So I know many of you are waiting, well, how does this connect? How do the 8 state priorities connect to the new accountability system? They will. We're working on it. We're trying to get some word out at the January board meeting. Don't quote me on that. The board has been really grappling with this transition in a very healthy way, but it's hard to sort of have the LCAP and the LCFF and the 8 state priorities and the rubric design and the collaborative for educational excellence sort of as pieces of the puzzle without saying, and how do all those pieces fit together? That's the work that the state board has been working on along with the department. And of course, the state priorities are the foundation for these. So here's the guiding principles around which the LCAPs are designed. And by the way, if any of these slides can be of use to you, or you want to take them and modify them and change them and do whatever, that's perfectly fine with me. I'm sure Bonnie will have them posted, but feel free, if any of this is helpful to you, use it in any way that makes sense. Right, it's all about performance. What did we do that had an impact on the results for our unduplicated students particularly, but for everybody, right? What did we do, and what was the result? They got better in reading, they didn't get better in reading, they got better in math, they didn't get better in math, and this year it's all about formative metrics. You're going to have to use what you've got in order to determine that, and obviously in terms of the funding that went towards that, so you had some supplemental funds that were supposed to go above and beyond to support those groups. So what did they receive, and what happened as a result of that? That's the question you have to keep asking everybody and looking for evidence of what happened. And it's short term here, right? It's only formative. We're only, 12 weeks in. You're not going to have huge, everybody's now proficient, right? We tried that for 14 years. It didn't work out so well, did it? Simplicity and transparency. How do you continue to communicate with everybody in a way that makes sense? Student focused, right? This is, as always in our business, what's happening for students every day in every classroom in every school. And with Common Core implementation and the expectations that we're looking at rigor and complexity, adds to the pieces of the puzzle. State priorities, where the defined metrics are there, and we're going to look at those in just a minute, but you have to rely on your local stuff this year, particularly, and ongoing, right? Because that's really where the real heart of the matter lies. And how are you going to use that data? And of course, it's all about really good engagement, ongoing supportive engagement that helps everybody get to where they need to go in the best possible way. So the issue is, I should have made this, a legal size. Here are some of the challenges. How do we get from here? County board approved your LCAP. It's a 3-year plan. Your board approved it. And your goal is all students leave high school and college career ready, unduplicated students well served. No difficulty there, right? How are we going to do that? That's the commitment we've made in our system. And what are the actions and services that are going to really help you get there? That's what the annual review is about. We have our plan, we've done this, we think this is going to help us get there. Did it not? Here's how we're going to adjust it. Right? But this is a very big distance. Similarly with assessments, where I use this graphic again because it was easy to do. The other piece of the puzzle is, along with the big picture, here are the 8 state priorities. You've seen these in many different ways. I happen to like this one just because it's easy, all on one page. It's still about needs assessment, goals, resources, alignment, services, outcomes. The degree to which these measures, as identified for each of the 8 state priorities, are big pieces of what we are going to have evidence of, but not in time this year. So what else have you got that is data-driven, evidence-based on what you're doing, how it's going, what you need to do next? Because that's really what your plan is about in this first year of implementation. And as a result, you've got to communicate the progress in whatever way best meets your needs and at what level of detail. Right? Plans are approved, the year has started, the goals are clear, timelines in place, it's board approved. Oh, how are we going to measure this? I've heard several districts, none in this room I'm sure, say that. You know, we just tried to kind of get it down on paper. We only had 6 months. We did some good community outreach. We've got some good goals and actions and services. We didn't have real clarity on the metrics yet. Well, it's time to build that piece in if it's not there. If you've got some good metrics, all the more important. But try to pace yourselves, right? What's the most important information that you need? Because you can't measure it all. And if simplicity and transparency are still the biggest goals, right, as part of this process, what are you going to pull in there that makes the most sense in your local context? Because your plans are vulnerable, right? Because where plans go awry, and hence back to the senior fellow, although I think it should be senior fellowette, frankly, as an old feminist, but I won't go there. Plans are most vulnerable not in their development, but in what? Everyone say it with me. Implementation. I, in my long, as my father would say, you may be smart, Nancy, but you sure can't keep a job, as I've changed a lot of things over the years. Implementation is critical, right? The plan is what you said you think you're going to do. Now you're into, what are we doing? How's it going? What does it look like? What's the difference for students? What are the actions and services? How are we tracking the funds to support those? Right? And implementation hinges on measurable indicators, which are formative this year. Do some good work in your community, right? We've been telling teachers all year, we don't have the data yet on Common Core summative assessments from Smarter. We took the field test and we all went, whoa. We better up the game, right? More rigor, more complexity. We're asking students to demonstrate their learning in a much different way. Parallel experience for all of you in leadership roles, right? Your plans are written, you've got your actions and services, you've got your identified goals. Okay, what's the formative assessment on how you're doing and how you're moving it forward? It's very similar. It's not a perfect system right now. I love this quote from these folks who do a lot on strategic planning, because I've lived this, as many of you have, right? I have many plans on my shelf in my past lives about stuff we were going to do. Wrote the plan, put it on the shelf, end of the story. Plan is a group of intentions always on the verge of greatness. To me, that is so true in my own experience. You know, I wrote some terrific plans over the years. Did it impact students in a positive way? I don't know. Did it seem like a good idea at the time? Oh, yeah. Did we really think that we were doing great stuff? Yes. Did we measure progress? No. Right? So, plans are your roadmap. Metrics keep you from getting lost in this very fluid, a lot of changes happening simultaneously, a time that we're in. So, your metrics for this year, just given where we are and what we're doing, right, is they're probably more anecdotal. They're subjective and interpretive a little bit. And you'll have some qualitative stuff. What about your district benchmark assessments, right? You're implementing Common Core. You did something. You're about to give report cards if you haven't already. What did you base all that stuff on? Are teachers using more performance-based assessments and assignments? How much more writing is going on? Those are all really good ideas to think about implementation of the standards, right? You also will have some quantitative measures this year that are mostly local, right? So what are they? And pull them out and start thinking about how you're going to report on them. Linked to your actions and services, which is about your annual update, right? You're doing twofer work. The work you're doing now will feed into your annual update. It's the same. So why not really get a good picture of that as you're working on it? And you have to use some relevant, reasonably relevant measures, right? All kids college and career ready by the time they leave us. Well, what does that mean in third grade? I don't know. That's what we're all trying to figure out, right? So what are the pieces that you can peel off a couple metrics based on the work that you know you're doing so importantly in your districts? And more importantly, it's got to be a sound process with trustworthy information. Even if you say, we thought we could do this and it's going slower than we think, we have to be honest about this progress because this is very complex work, as you well know. Look at the conditions for learning. Look at the achievement. Look at the opportunities to really improve rigor and complexity for students. So in your actions and services, keep in mind it's both technical and about the relationships in your district, with your teachers, with your principals, with your community, with your parents. And that you learned, I'm sure, in all the terrific engagement work that happened, right, over the last year in terms of writing them. Well, you got to keep that relationship building going. That's really, if you're a small district, very time consuming, right? Because you got to sort of, you know, how leadership is told about the care and feeding of the board members. Well, in small districts, you don't have very many people to care and feed for the school board members, nor for the community leadership. It's sort of similar pieces in play. So you're going to have some process measurements, and you're going to have some outcomes. But some of that process stuff in year one is probably very helpful. Trust, can't say enough about, you got to keep building it. And your formative measures are not a complete design this year, right? Just like the formative measures we're working on in the classroom. What's the best tools to select evidence of where you are, where you're headed, and what you can reasonably accomplish in this first year? Because some of it this year is a lot about inputs. You're establishing structures, you're hiring people, you're changing the way you do coaching, or whatever it is you're doing. You got to talk about that and talk about what the impact is on your teachers, for example. So you're going to probably do some surveys. You're going to survey your kids. Is it harder this year than it was last year? I mean, you really don't ask that question, but they're all going to say yes, and so are their parents, right? You've all sat in those meetings with parents about what's happening in mathematics, especially if you have middle or high schoolers. Lastly here, the process for using the metrics has got to begin to continue that trust building, right? So being honest about it. We think these are the ones to start with this year. We know we're going to learn more by the end of the year, but as a result, we've got to think about how to sort of put the pieces together in the most important way for our communities. Because formative metrics, just like in a classroom, right, they have to be credible, they have to be feasible, and they have to be valuable, both to you as the implementers and to the students and community members who are impacted by what you're doing. So given that little speedy context, I'm going to adjust these times a little bit. What I would like you to do in a moment, and hello Palmdale, this will give you a chance to chat in your context as well. I want you to chat with your colleagues. What are your metric challenges? And which ones are pretty solid? And if you need to pull out your LCAP or you have a piece of it in front of you, better. Then, in addition, you should have a trusty chart that looks like this. It's a grid, Palmdale, that has some pieces stapled to it. Like you, we're trying to find resources that make sense out there. I've given you a little bit of a framework to use for your conversation. There will not be a test on this information at the end of the session. You may take this away with you. But I want to tell you what's in here is the first page is the same thing as the 8 state priorities chart, only a little different. It just has the categories and the metrics that are available along with some thinking about, so what other locals might be helpful there. And then the next couple of pages that start with number 1 at the bottom, they say LCAP local metric considerations Kudos to our colleagues in Contra Costa County Office of Education. They had pulled some of these together, and I went, oh, this is great. I've been trying to pull these things together, and may I use these and adapt them with mine? And they said, by all means, just attribute us for our good hard work. Contra Costa County, thank you very much for your good hard work. But notice, curriculum and instruction on the very first page. What if some of the measures you had were the number and percentage of students and teachers using performance tasks? What if you had the percentage of teachers that are reflecting the shifts in the CCSS? You know, what about courses that have agreed to writing expectations or literacy, disciplinary literacy at middle and high school? That's the kind of thinking you got to pull in. Those are very good result measures in this formative way. So I've given you way too many here with the knowledge that you as very strong professionals will pick and choose carefully. The last thing you want is, 50 local metrics. I don't think. But maybe you're a better person, a better senior than I am, right? You got to kind of look at what are your goals, what are your actions and services, where might you flesh out some of those impacts, and obviously with your fiscal support, the funding that you're putting towards those will determine again whether you're really sort of paying what needs to be done on the unduplicated students for better learning, as we might say. And so that's just a rough packet of resources in addition to what you already know. Talk about this, be selective, share a little bit at your table. So I'll sort of be timekeeper, but go. Talk about this or talk about anything else I said in the last half an hour. Go. Couple of other pieces to add to the picture. Right? I think you have to think about what does formative progress mean? Does everybody have the same understanding of formative progress? I don't know. Probably not. In my experience, right, very seldom is there a time when we all agree on what we think we know. But there's essentially, some basic structures to formative progress, whether you're so closing in on sort of some additional things to think about as if you didn't have enough already, right? First off, this very important concept that we've all grappled with and tried to build on for much of our careers is to begin with the end in mind, right? Let's keep in mind that the LCAP is a piece of evidence reflective of the local control funding formula changes that have occurred in state policy with the common goal that we are trying to ensure at a deeper level probably than we have in the past, although this has been a common goal, that students learn what they need to know and do to be successful in life, right? Having been well taught by competent professionals in adequately resourced schools that are responsive to student needs, right? This is what the LCAP is about. This is what LCFF is about. This is what your actions and services are all about. So let's keep that in the forefront there's a ton of minutia to sort of get bogged down in, and you have to at a management level to some degree, but let's keep saying out loud what it is we're about in this time of lots of changes, because it's easy to get sidetracked. Razor-like lens, right? Sharpening the saw, as Covey would say. It's all about keeping the work. And this is where we're headed now, where we hope to continue to head for the next few years. And we all know the complexities of what this really means. This looks quite simple in a paragraph or so. So the big next step that is a more longer term piece, but what I think you have to be sort of leading your goals towards is this idea of college and career readiness. Right? And this is part of the work that David Connolly has done in working with us at the department level. And this notion on college readiness, we are much better in our profession about figuring out college readiness, right? We all went to college. We probably did well, most of us. That's why we are in these jobs, right? My 28-year-old son, who's probably the smartest kid in the family, did not do well in school, right? He's the one that drove his mother crazy. But I have a much deeper appreciation because he is not the classic successful student. He's the smart aleck and the one who says during high school, you want me to be the dumb kid? Oh, I'll be the dumb kid. And you don't want a smart kid playing the dumb kid because he caused enormous grief, both to his mother and his teachers. But he was one that did not have some of the other college readiness skills that he would have greatly benefited from. And he's, as we like to say, moving toward, he's back home now for a little while, but he's heading out again at 28, but that's all right. As long as he takes his stupid dogs with him, I'll be fine. Key cognitive strategies, right? It is about the cognition and problem solving, right? It's so important to keep that in mind. It's also about stuff you know. This is one of the counter arguments, the anti-Common Core people are telling us we're not teaching content anymore. We are teaching content. Key content knowledge, it's big ideas. It's about academic behaviors, this whole notion of self-management, time management, study skills, self-awareness, grit, persistence. Not just because of Common Core in college, it's because you need that in life, Kevin, right? He needed way more of this earlier on. I'm sorry. He would really be on my case if he knew that he was such a great example. The contextual skills, right? First generation going. AVID, we've done tremendous things with AVID, but if you've never been to college, and if you're the first in your family to go to college, you don't know, right? How many of you were first generation college going? Yeah, it's amazing what you didn't know, right? And you made sure your own children knew it because you knew you had to learn the hard way. It really is so important. So this idea that the David Connolly group out of University of Oregon has sort of mapped some of this connection to college readiness. And my bias personally is that we privilege A to G in our master schedules. And I know why that is, and I know it's important, but for kids like Kevin, that did not serve him well. ROP Electronics, as a sophomore and a junior in high school at 7 a.m. in the morning, believe it or not, got that kid through high school. Applied. What do you know and what can you do? And A to G is a very important part of the picture, but we're not as clear on the career readiness, and we still have a lot of work to do in that area. Because if we're going to assess these 4 dimensions, both around college readiness and career readiness, we don't know nearly as much as we need to, and this is really the work that the board and the Department of Education have to kind of get a better picture of as we develop a new accountability system, right? That in many cases, we kind of intensely measure this key content knowledge, right? End of course exams, AP courses, unit tests, a lot of good stuff happens. Some of that we still need to do, right? We almost over-test that. Key cognitive strategies, we occasionally measure these. Reading comprehension strategies, right? We do some cognitive development, not nearly as much as we really need to. Key learning skills and techniques and key transition to college, unless they're like in AVID or one of those programs that's really targeting first-generation students, we don't test that at all. And that isn't just about going to college and careers, that's about life. So what we're trying to do is where in this sort of sweet spot do we pull in the measures that are going to really provide a multiple measured picture of how students are progressing. And that's going to really be key to the new accountability system we develop, and it's critically important really in the Smarter Balanced system, particularly at middle and high school, although we've got to do some framing of that along the way. So given that, you can see why some of the formative work you're doing this year is really based on stuff that hasn't been quite invented all the way yet. So measuring college and career readiness means that we've really got to get a broader range of measures, which you all are struggling with in your local context, just in general, I think, around the LCAPs in a good way, right? And if you're really working at the high school level and middle school level, not all students need the same set, right? It's about differentiation, as it always has been. So how do you, in the local context, you can make some adjustments in your courses and your opportunities for learning for students. How do we adjust a state accountability system to allow for some flexibility? Because that's really going to be critical to the success here. And we have to come up with some profiles of student success, right? We tried this in the 90s. We had a class assessment system. Anybody around then? Was not a bad system, but it died of its own weight, right? It became a political football under Pete Wilson, but also we had 1 million+ papers that we didn't quite get read, even though we spent 6 weeks of the summer reading them. It was a great idea. It was probably a little premature, but it's a lot of work to do portfolios, more authentic measures. The computer adapted systems have gained us some time, but we got to figure this out. And in relationship to post-secondary programs, what would allow better matches for students like Kevin and students like my daughter, who was good in school, became a teacher, right? She became one of us. She figured out the system and was good at it. So we have this very different student population across the state. In your local context, how are you allowing for some of that differentiation? And this is part of why building a new accountability system is more complicated than it sounds. So we have a lot of decisions ahead in the state. I'm not going to go into really defining all of them, but this is why we have to think carefully over the next couple of months to try to begin to build the expectations and content for the accountability, right? We need this sort of continuum of readiness. What does that mean? What does it look like? We obviously, if you have a narrow definition, just like in your LCAPs, it's much easier to measure. Right? 80% of our kids score a 3. Well, that's a noble goal. I would hope we could get there. You can measure that. If you have a broader measure that includes several different kinds of ways to talk about career and college readiness, that's more complicated. We're also trying to look at actionable information, right? What should the state collect, have access to, that is useful to all of you? That's a very important question for many of us, right? Just because we can pull data together, is it useful data? I won't answer that question, but sometimes you wonder. College and career ready definitions have overlap, just as you saw in that diagram with the circles, right? Some of it makes sense connecting it together, some of it doesn't. And college readiness and career readiness are not exactly the same. So how do we build the system for accountability along with the summative assessments of Smarter Balance that are going to allow you to have the kind of data that you need and that you can use? And one of the pieces of Smarter, obviously, right, is this idea of the formative assessment tools and practices around the digital library and some of those curriculum resources. There seems to still be a lot of confusion on this. Notice this: formative assessment tools and practices. These are not tests, right? Not test items. Resources, digital library, observational tools, lots of good practical pieces. Interim assessments, flexible, open, used for actionable feedback in blocks or in items, hopefully ready in January, knock on wood. They're working diligently on it. They did the cut scores for Smarter Balance this last week and a half. They've got to crunch all that data based on the field test review items. So Smarter Balance will help, but it's not the whole picture. It's a measure. So what else should the state have? And we have a governor who says we test too much. Don't create the old system on a computer. We're not going there. We probably won't have end of course exams at the state level. Again, I grew up in a time when we had minimum competencies, the statutes of 1978, where every district determined what those minimum competencies were. I worked in a big district. We had about 25,000 essays a year that we read and scored. Best writing, professional development we could do. Grades 3, 5, 7, and 10, right? Those were individual local district measures. Some were very good, some were not so good. So what's the role of the state? What could and should be available? What resources might be of use? And there will be a lot of emphasis on local measures, because if this looks familiar from the earlier part, right? Here we are with our assessment challenges. How do we get from here to there? Right? Common Core standards specify K-12 expectations for college and career, along with NGSS. All students leave high school, college, and career ready. Simple, right? Assessment. How will it help? And what should be at the state system? What will you still need to look at the local system? Right? Just having a new assessment system is probably not enough. Just like having an LCAP doesn't necessarily mean your kids are getting good actions and services from you. So this is part of the picture of the next couple years, leading towards much more specificity on evidence-based designs, which we have all grappled with over the last few years, right? So we're clearer and clearer on what knowledge do we want students to have and how do we want them to know it. Those are the claims and the targets built on the learning progressions and the individual grade level standards, right? What evidence is acceptable? How good is good enough? That's the question teachers ask in their class every day, right? We're going to have rubrics. We're going to have a lot of good questions. Similarly with your LCAP, how good is good enough, folks? What's your metrics and measures to help show in evidence-based formats that you're making progress? And it's always about what, for the classroom level, first off, how do we interpret that evidence? Right? Good data is good data, but you have to interpret and see what it is that you can make inference from, as well as just straight interpretation. In the classrooms, it's what tasks will students perform to communicate their knowledge, and that's totally in the control of the teachers and departments and grade level teams. For you, it's about what actions and services in your LCAP really help lead to what you want to have happen for your students. So again, the parallel between what teachers are doing in their classrooms related to Common Core implementation and how you are approaching your LCAPs, there's just an enormous amount of similarity to the intellectual work. So our new accountability system, which the board hasn't really finished looking at all the elements, clearly the local control funding formula and the state priorities will be the foundation of that. No doubt about that, right? So stay the course on your LCAPs, keep learning. The hope also is that it will really be a continuous improvement model that allows schools and districts to continue to get better at the work that you're doing on behalf of students and not be as much of a punitive system as our past model. And it's going to have to focus on a broader set of outcomes, very much like the question we got from Palmdale about metacognitive skills, about the conditions for learning. Those aren't going to be a part probably of a state accountability system, because how would we mesh all that together? I don't know. But at your local level, what would be some determiners that really help you gain some insight into how your students are doing? And again, it's about college, career, and life ready, right? So it's still in this new system about providing transparency. If any of you have watched the board meetings over the last year, we've had a lot of folks come and talk at the board meetings. 1 4-hour time was the one we all lived through in a very good way. But how are you making, she said it honestly, it's about support of student achievement and outcomes, as always, right? So how is that working? How are your metrics helping you? How are those community meetings helping you? How's the communication both internally and externally, right? Do your classified staff know what you're about, right? They're the first line of entrance to the school secretary at the elementary level, even at the high school level, right? What do they know about what you're doing? How are they communicating that? It's also intended to focus district and school leaders on significant areas for improvement, right? We're not perfect. We've got areas of strength and areas of need, and how do we target that? That's going to be the role of the rubrics, which I don't have a lot of time to talk about, that are in the middle of development right now, along with the Collaborative for Educational Excellence as a sort of another key body to help build this continuous improvement model. So in terms of accountability, because this is a formative year for you, it really is similar at the Department of Ed, right? We aren't going to have a lot of data. So how do we think about reporting well-timed, accessible, and actionable data? What is the state's role in trying to build this new system? How do we think about driving continuous improvement that does allow us to differentiate, right? The California state budget is always the 7th or 8th largest in the world in terms of amount of money. 45% of that money goes to pre-K through community college education. The legislators are not going to let us off the hook on this to just go about our business, right? Accountability matters. It matters to all of us. It's about way more than just how we spend the money. That's a critical piece. What are the resources that we provide in order to help students? So we have to think about, at our level, while you're working on the demands of your LCAP, we're trying to think about these larger goals in an accountability system that can be connected to the work that you're doing really in terms of the 8 state priorities and the development of your LCAPs and the full implementation of the local control funding formula over time, right? We're still in year 1, so we all have a lot of work to do, and it's always with this idea that we're trying to really build a continuous improvement model. And the good news is, again, because the governor is likely to get reelected, that the state board will continue to drive the decision making over the course of the next few years to try to implement incrementally in a way that builds on what you're learning from LCFF and LCAP this year and moves into a more extensive look at what we're trying to do. So it is about collective accountability and shared responsibility, right? And that's the message in working with community members and parents, right? They want to have a lot of say, but where are they accountable for what happens? And how do you sort of marry those concepts, right? We want them assisting their individual children and youth. But the bottom line is we want their input and we want to measure it through the lens of professional capacity that we all bring to the table. But we're the ones that are also being held accountable moving forward for what does occur. And we want to create that trusting partnership, but it's going to take all of us, right? This is hard work. This is complex. This is the best of what the next generation really in public schools in California is going to be built on, which is very exciting for those of us exiting, right? Senior fellowette, among others. But I'm so glad to see so many younger people in the room. It's terrific, right? This is a long-term, great effort in our state that has never happened. Right? Mike Kirst likes to say in 1972, when Jerry Brown was first elected governor, where were you in 1972? And if you remember, you probably weren't there. No. Jerry Brown was governor. Mike Kirst was president of the state board. And they began talking way back then, probably about subsidiarity, but I didn't ask. And they now, 40-some years later, Jerry Brown is governor. Michael Kirst from Stanford, retired Stanford professor, is the president of the state board, and they get a policy do-over in a state as large and diverse as ours. How does that possibly happen? I was a beginning teacher in 1972. I didn't know the state board from whatever, right? I was lucky to find my room. And now we get a chance to really think about what could, should, might a very rigorous, locally controlled educational system look like in our state? So the stakes are high for all of us, because we ain't going to get another chance like this, I don't think, ever. So hang in there. Keep working hard. You got a lot to do. And we're all counting on you. The long-term development are pieces, obviously, that still matter, right? So in this context of your local plans and your formative metrics, you are looking at what happens first, what you're working on this year, what makes sense in a reasonable way around your priority goals, but you also know that these other pieces are going to be coming in, right? So the evaluation rubric design process, we're posting all of that information on the LCFF WestEd website. The rubric design process is intended to be another tool that has to be adopted by the state board in October of 2015, very soon, that helps around the three big buckets, right? Conditions of learning, student achievement, and why am I blanking on the third one? County office folks, what's the other big bucket from LCAP? Engagement, thank you. The most important one, I think. No. And the purpose of these rubrics is to provide those of you that are writing LCAPs with some guidance around a continuous improvement model, and for the county offices and the Department of Education who are reading LCAPs at the district and county level to provide some feedback to you on strengths and needs around the revised template and annual update, which will be on the November 12th, 13th board agenda. Looks very much like the draft we had in September, had very few changes, but it's not official until the board adopts it, along with the permanent regulations in a couple weeks. Someone at the break said, you know, it seems like it'd be a good idea to start using the new template when I'm working on my revision and my annual update. Yes, that is a great idea. It looks very similar. It's not as cluttered. The text is in one place. You can look at the one from that's item 18 on the September board agenda. It'll come in a revised format without the draft in there, but I would work with that one going forward. Excellent idea. And the California Collaborative on Educational Excellence is not exactly patterned after FCMAT. Those of you in the financial world know that almost 20 years ago this idea was, what if a group of experts in finance came together to help advise and put together a set of really good metrics around keeping districts solvent financially? And during the DATE, District Assistance and Intervention time at the county offices, we tried to sort of think about, we joked about ACMAT, the academic version, right, of FCMAT, right? What if just because you don't spend your money, right, or you go into debt, that's bad. What about if you don't serve kids well? Doesn't matter on that end? We never said that out loud, but the issue is the collaborative is sort of intended to be similar, only focused on program, on really looking at technical assistance in supporting districts that need more success, in having another mechanism with resources and people to help assist. And part of that, obviously, is the Public Schools Accountability Act, and that advisory is to the superintendent, who's been working on some good college and career pieces, but in the abstract, without an accountability system, you have to sort of figure out how all of these are going to line up. So that's the work that the State Board and the Department of Education are working on, in case you thought we were slacking off. So you have the heavy lift, but then also additional assessments, right? If it's not going to be state mandated assessments, what could it be? What should they be? Could there be references that you could use? Or should we develop some additional ones? Still to be answered. So, a few last considerations and takeaways, right? These are multi-dimensional, multi-year plans in progress. Exciting time to be in our business. A lot happening all at the same time. These standards are not, your father's Oldsmobile, as we used to say, right? These are not new names. for old standards. We're trying to fundamentally change the way we ask students to learn and think and respond and do in the context of pre-K-12 schooling. We're also asking them to be welcomed into schools that vary dramatically across the state in really interesting ways, right? As valuable people that we want to serve well, going back to our common goal, whether you're poor, whether you speak a language other than English, whether you have a lot of financial resources, right? We are about public education and the greater good. We're also trying to really marry, I think, at the best possible time, the art and science of teaching. I came into this profession when it was really much more about the art of teaching and sort of learned by the seat of my pants, like everybody who came in the 70s, right? It was totally about what you thought. You had resources, you did a lot of interesting things, but you had a lot of flexibility. We do know that we can learn more from using data, from measuring formative assessments in a more deliberate way, to really making sure students have access to the whole curriculum. So what does the art and science of teaching and learning really look like in this 21st century time that we're in? And it's about what do kids know and what can they do with that information, right? It's the learning and doing continuum, similar to what teachers have to do. What did you learn about teaching and what do you do with that knowledge through preparation, induction, and ongoing professional development? And lastly, it's all about these internal collective accountability systems in the truest sense of it, that if it's not about punishment, if it really is about continuous improvement, what is that going to look like? How are we going to do that? And there's a lot to be done. So I happen to be a big Eagles fan, the band. I've actually stupidly been to 3 of their concerts in this last year. I went to the LA Forum, and it was amazing. They're old guys, right? I grew up with these guys, like others, and I look at them going, and I couldn't stand up there and play music for 3 hours. But in the History of the Eagles DVD, there is a point here, believe me. Glenn Frey talks about how he learned to become a songwriter, that they lived in Echo Park. Jackson Browne happened to be in the little downstairs, not really an apartment, and J.D. Souther and Glenn Frey were upstairs. And Jackson Browne would get up in the morning, put on his tea kettle, and then he'd play over and over and over and over until J.D. said he was about ready to kill him, right? And Glenn Frey had come from Detroit, Michigan, but didn't know about songwriting, and he said, I learned to become a songwriter by listening to what Jackson Browne did in the basement. And he said it took elbow grease, time, thought, although he also talks about it, revision, and persistence. And when I first heard that, of course, I was immersed in Common Core work and said, that's what Common Core is about, too. But I also think it's about the implementation of the LCFF and the LCAPs and your capacity in your local context to really determine important goals for your students and be able to set logical, coherent metrics that really provide you with important information at the qualitative and the quantitative levels that are going to help you do what's right on behalf of the students in our state, because that's why we got into this profession, right? And so in thinking about the Eagles, as you hum a few bars, right, we are in that time of deeper implementation. It's about elbow grease and time and thought and persistence. It's not very glamorous, right? Some of it is very successful, some of it is not likely to be, but stay the course in your local context and pay attention to what's happening in your communities. We at the policy level, at the department and at the state board are trying not to intervene too dramatically. So on that note, I would like you to take 5 minutes at your table and I want you to think about what's 1 or 2 big ideas you want to take away from your time this afternoon on your LCAP development, on formative metrics, or on anything else that is really the most important thing in your mind right now, and then we'll close it off. So 5 minutes, go. There. So we do have a couple of questions. There was a dual immersion question from Palmdale that says, we understand that local assessments need to be developed to assess students in the second language. Will CDE be helping with that? development of Spanish assessments and translation with Smarter Balance. I have to get the answer to that question and we'll send it to Bonnie. So all of you, there is some work ongoing, right? We're writing a new LCAP to replace SELT. That is a different assessment that comes earlier in the year. There's timelines working on that. Some of the, we're sort of examining, do we need to continue to have a standards test for Spanish speakers, or could it be translations of Smarter Balance? So I'm not exactly sure the up-to-date answer, and I'll find it out and send it to you. To Bonnie. There's been a couple questions. I should be more clear in my explanation. What's the difference between and/or specifics for the LCAP update and the annual revision? What's the timeline for each? Does the update come first? So after the board adopts at the November 12th and 13th meeting, there is the revised template, which looks very much like from the September meeting, and we changed it from your June experiences to have all the text be in one place and have it be a sort of much more straightforward goals and objectives and outcomes and funding streams page with checkoff boxes for, is it for the whole school and what's happening for your unduplicated counts. The annual update, as it is officially called, looks exactly the same, only it says annual update. And so what will be required is you will be updating based on those earlier comments I made, right? What were your expectations, what actually happened, and what were the changes, and you will map that onto your update. And if you need to make revisions then to your LCAP for year 2, those would show up. So our assumption is that will be a document that has your goal, your actions and services, and your annual update on what occurred as a result of that, and that will all be put together when you submit June 30th to county offices. So we'll have probably, the counties are working on their LCAP manuals, right? We got the first year under their belts, what happens now, technical assistance this year, but it'll become clear after the board adopts it, right? It hasn't been officially adopted, and that's what we're waiting for, and then there will be guidance on what to do with it, and hopefully that answered the Palmdale question. So, any other questions for the good of the order?
Yes, over here.
Yes.
Yes, so that's 2 different documents.
No, it's almost like the annual update is a single page that may be inserted into that page of the LCAP. I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but it's not going to be 2 separate docs.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Well, I mean, it's a single page that you have to report on.
But how can it be a single page?
Well, we're trying to, we're trying to determine if it's an appendix. Is it an update? I mean, that's why there's confusion about the language, and it will become clearer once the board adopts it in November. Then we'll be able to talk about what to do. We just can't figure that out yet because they haven't adopted it. Okay. But yes, you're on the right page. We're trying to keep it simple and not too complex for you.
Any information on the alignment of LCAP and single plan for student achievement?
Yes. I'm going to get in trouble with the department for this, but I don't care. I get in trouble a lot downtown. I'm a senior fellow, so. Yes. Here's what we're doing in my district. I'll speak on behalf of my local district. The single plans goals are the same as the LCAP. And what they're doing is a little bit different on how they're delivering, but the goals are the same.
What about from the state level? We've done a similar thing in our locally, but
yes.
State level.
There was a piece of legislation by Shirley Weber that the governor vetoed that was trying to sort of figure out this single plan, and it was sort of the wrong vehicle, right topic, wrong legislation. So the question is that the board is trying to grapple with, what is the single plan for student achievement these days? Other than part of the federal accountability system, which we're sort of annoyed with anyway. So the state is working on that. It's because of the federal accountability system that we even have still a single plan. And for federal program monitoring, yes, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense in the context of California. And we recognize that. We know something needs to be done about it at the policy level. But for now, go with your LCAP goals, right? But I said that as a board member in a local district. That's right. And I know I will get in trouble, but that's all right. So you're asking the right question, but it's absolutely the time to say what? Similarly with the LEAP.
Yeah, with the LEAP.
Right, the LEAP is right there. The state board's perspective is the LCAP is the basis for planning in California. What do we need to make that workable with the feds? And we're going to go to the feds because who knows when they're going to get their stuff together to revise ESEA, right? We are going to use this for our LCAP, for our LEAP, and maybe it has to have some additional data that could go in the Con Ed. Let's be sensible here. So we know that's an issue. We're working on it, and we wish the feds would leave us alone. But we do want the money.
Oh, but you want the money.
Well, I wish you well from State President of the Board of Education, Mike Hurst, and State Superintendent Tom Torlipson. They appreciate how much hard work is going on out there in the field. We wish you well this year, and please carry on. There's a lot of great stuff happening in our state. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for taking us deeper into this work and in a very practical way, as you always do.